Mike Tirico here with some of the 2024 Team USA athletes. What's your message for the team of tomorrow?
To young athletes, never forget why you started doing it in the first place.
You have to pursue something that you're passionate about.
Win, lose, or draw, I'm always going to be the one having a smile on my face.
Finding joy in why you do it keeps you doing it.
Be authentic, be you, and have fun.
Joy is powering Team USA during the Olympic and Paralympic Games. Comcast is proud to be bringing that inspiration home for the team of tomorrow.
This Choircast podcast episode is brought to you by Divine Echoes, reconciling prayer with the uncontrolling love of God. How the heck does petitionary prayer work in a world where there's so much suffering and evil? Is praying for others just a religious, superstitious practice that does nothing at all except make the person praying feel better? If you are looking for a pioneering book on prayer that is thought-provoking, challenging, and endorsed by some of today's most well-known authors and scholars, then Divine Echoes is the book for you.
Liminal. A word 1,000 miles wide but small enough to fit into the present moment. It describes an in-between place. We live most of our lives within this space, not quite ever arriving at our idealistic final destination. We spend so much of our energies on our best impersonation of who we wish we were, until we can't. But in sneaks a dark night of the soul, or perhaps a mystical experience. Our way of being has an error loop introduced. Today we call that deconstruction. Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast, where we teach you how to be here, how to traverse these spaces, and where we can go if we remain humble, open, and honest. Well, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast, where we explore the thresholds of faith and spirituality in the human experience. I'm your curator of conversations, Tom Rundell, and I am currently on vacation, and we are re-airing some of my most favorite episodes from last season, Season 2. As a part of this August recast series, we're going to be bringing you a few of these episodes that I learned a lot about, with some fresh introductions and outros that provide a few more insights and reflections. So today, we're revisiting one of our most thought-provoking conversations and my most downloaded episode of all time, Dr. Chris Green. He's a profound thinker and inspiring voice in the field of theology. Dr. Green is professor of public theology at Southeastern University, the bishop of the Diocese of St. Anthony, and the director of the St. Anthony Institute of Theology, Philosophy, and Liturgics. He's also author of many works. His latest book, All Things Beautiful and Aesthetic Christology, is a good one. You're going to want to pick that up. In this episode that originally aired last year in December, Dr. Green and I delve into a fascinating discussion about the role of art and imagination in theology. And we explore how theology often becomes more about finding the right, quote-unquote, answers to impress and display, a lot like trophy hunting. But as Dr. Green beautifully puts it, trophies are dead things. Instead, he advocates for embracing living questions, those small answers that lead to more questions and deeper explorations. And throughout our conversation, we cover a range of topics, from the origins of his art to its transforming power, and how it can reveal truth to us and engage our faith. We touch on how art involves us in truth, not just reveals it, but involves us and opens us up to new dimensions of understanding by communicating to us in ways that bypass that cerebral cortex kind of thinking. And it plays a crucial part in our spiritual and intellectual journeys. So you'll hear us talk a little bit about his roots in what he called sweaty Pentecostalism, which I thought was pretty funny, and the tendency to know more about demons than about God in that tradition, and then the profound insights that he has gleaned from his one of his heroes, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And we also discuss the concept of finding a true place to belong and how the Incarnation theology shows us what God is truly like in the person of Christ. This conversation with Dr. Chris Green is rich, it's insightful, it's thought-provoking, and remains incredibly relevant even now, a couple months later. It's a wonderful conversation. So whether you're hearing this episode for the first time or revisiting this episode for a second time, I hope you find it as enlightening and inspiring as I did. So without any more adoing, let's dive into this recent recast episode with Dr. Chris Green. Well, Dr. Chris Green, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. It is a joy to have you on with us today.
Thank you, Tom. It's good to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Hey, I see your puppy in the background now. That's not Carl?
Well, it is Carl, but the kids won't let me call him Carl. That's Augie, which is short for Carl Augustin Weimaraner, which, again, as I said to you, is a wonderful joke for me. The kids, it's lost on them.
Because you like Carl Rainer. I've always called him Rainer because I read everything. I don't listen to it, so I never know how I'm supposed to pronounce these names.
A lot of people refer to the breed as Rainer, so that would work too.
Mm. He's a cute doggy. Dogs are welcome on this podcast.
Yeah, he's overwhelmingly sweet. He's the gentlest dog I've ever been around.
I can
He's
see
playful,
it.
but incredibly gentle.
Oh, yeah, that's that breed there as well. Well, we've kind of been, it was a long journey to get here. You've had some stuff happening to reschedule. I've had some stuff happening to reschedule, and I'm so glad we get to land here today for the third week of Advent is when this one will drop. And I've been following your Facebook feed, your podcast, your writing for some time, and I can't remember how I found you, probably through Father Kenneth Tanner. I bet you that's where he probably quoted you. And I was like, dang.
He's to blame for a lot of it, for sure.
He is the blame. And he was just on here last week. And I was really enthralled with how you write just these theological perspectives that's more poetic. And then what I noticed was that you were posting some of the most stunning artwork, like modern iconography almost. It's just beautiful, where you have these works of Christ, Mary, Adam, Eve. You cover the events of the Holy Week, like crucifixion, Pentecost. You have these whole series, and they're absolutely stunning. Where did you find this knack of art?
It came back to me as a kid. I did. I was always painting or drawing. I wasn't particularly good at it. I mean, I think in terms of realistic representation, other kids around me, much more, they could draw a dog, and it was clearly not just a dog, but a particular dog, right? We could recognize, they could draw Carl Augustin Weimaraner and you'd recognize it.
Yeah. And
I didn't have that knack, but I did kind of always want to be drawing and would sketch scenes. Mm-hmm. So my mom worked for a newspaper, and she would bring home reams of paper, and I would kind of lay them out in my grandparents' house. They had a kind of open floor plan, so I would run it along across 3 or 4 rooms and tell a story in these pictures, kind of drawing them. So it wasn't about kind of accuracy of representation. It was much more kind of, what's the word I'm looking for here? Much more symbolic than that, yeah. Right? Where this represents that and this represents the other. And it helped me think. I realized that drawing in those ways was a way in which I was processing, I was thinking. Mm-hmm. And so I did a lot of that as a young kid. And then somewhere in my teenage years, I lost it. I lost touch with it. I stopped doing it. And when my grandmother died, she died the day after my 40th birthday. As she was dying and when she died, so, the last couple of years before she died and then when she died, I started to grieve. And with that grief, found my way back to painting and sketching again. Mm. And a lot of it, as you mentioned already, were images of Christ suffering and Mary suffering. And I think that's pretty obvious in terms of where my heart is, and it kind of has always been. And my work as a theologian, it would make sense that that's where it would go. And that's how I processed it. And it still is. Just yesterday, we got news in the morning about my father collapsing and having to be revived and taken to the emergency room. We weren't sure what it was. And in the waiting, I started drawing again, so there's something therapeutic about it. It's a language that I find my way to in times that are particularly difficult. And so a lot of the art, I think, reflects that pain.
Yeah.
I have no pretensions or illusions about being an artist, capital A, but I love to do it. Mm-hmm. And it's life-giving for me, for sure. Healing.
Yeah. And you say you weren't good at like the actual representation, and how you have adjusted, that I don't have that skill, but I can draw symbolically, and how you use lines. Mary can just be a simple line with, a bump for the head, a bump for the pregnant belly. And I know what it is.
Yeah.
And I know what you're communicating with it as well. And you're saying it's coming from this place that's deep within you, that is processing, grief and life, and connecting your story to the stories of the Gospels. And it's coming out in like this artistic expression. Have you seen your art evolve in any way, or have you kind of stuck in the same vein? And
No. I think there are lots of shifts for me. And some of that is, again, I'm processing, I'm thinking, I'm exploring, and I can tell the difference, between, sometimes an image will come to me either in a dream or in a flash, and I will do the best I can to get that image. And other times I'm sitting with a feeling, really, more than an image or a thought, and start to try to let that draw out of me, so to speak, right? It's that image of kind of pulling poison out of the wound. I think there's a way in which drawing for me does draw that out. And there's an image, I don't remember if this is on Instagram or not, but there's an image, it's a line drawing of the Holy Family, and it's Joseph and Mary turned toward each other with the belly between them. And it's very simple. I mean, I probably sketched it in a minute, maybe 2 minutes.
Wow.
But it came like in a flash. During a particular moment, I suddenly saw the Holy Family as one shape. And, so if you see the image, it's incredibly simple. It does have, I think, depth, because it is coming from my unconscious. It's coming from something deeper than, the right brain instrumentality.
Yeah.
That I think we often operate from. I mean, I could talk more about it, but you get the point. And you can see there's another one just to mention something else. There's another one that shows the face of Mary. It's one of the more joyous ones. It's the face of Mary looking at the stars. And this came to me hearing about the Magi. It was a sermon during Epiphany, and hearing about the Magi and the stars. And I just started to wonder, did Mary notice this star? Did she know it was there? If she did, what did she make of it? And something about that it took me from a place of kind of contemplation and wonder to delight. So if you see the piece,
I'm looking at it right now, actually.
you can see that that's wonder and joy. It's not grief, but there are lots of pieces. In fact, when I shared that one, I shared on Instagram. So if you're looking at it on Instagram, it's paired with an image of Mary that is deeply grieved. So it's a kind of look at her face as if she's seeing her own reflection in the water. Yeah. And again, that's an image that came to me of Mary. She's often represented in the tradition as being at a well when the angel comes to her. And what came to me is her bent over the well and seeing her face in this moment of the Annunciation. And she's deeply troubled. In fact, there's a light right in the center of her head that speaks also to me about headaches. I mean, migraines have been a major part of my story. And so some of this is about processing that pain, I think, at some level. But I mean, those are a couple of ways like in which I'm getting at. And those two pieces, those Mary pieces, are not line drawings. I mean, those are paintings.
Yeah, they're wonderful.
So you can see different, but there's no clear staging. It's not like, I went through a period where I was only painting and then did line drawings and vice versa. I mean, just I find my way around it, without really much intentionality. It's just whatever I'm, again, to play on words, whatever I'm drawn to.
Yeah, drawn. Yeah, and I mean, newsflash, you are an artist. This stuff is beautiful.
Thank you, man.
And
Appreciate it.
It communicates theology in a way that I think when you write, you do it in the same vein, in the same stream. You're not just telling people about ideas. When you're doing theology, you're doing it in this poetic, prophetic, artistic way that, I've listened to you, I think it was on the Inverse podcast. You were going through the book of Hebrews and you were just like, the guys were crying as you were explaining Hebrews, and I was, welling up in tears as you're explaining Hebrews. I've never cried reading Hebrews, but then hearing you explain it, that's something that only art does. It's not just, let me put information in your brain. You're like this artistic theologian. And
I don't think the All Things Beautiful book, which was the first of a trilogy. I talked about this in the introduction to that book. I mean, I really do think art is what moved me to prayer. When I was a young child, my parents had taken me to a museum, and I'd gotten separated from them, a bit like Jesus left in Jerusalem, I guess. And I walked around a corner. It was a house that had been converted to a museum.
Okay.
And so there's art kind of everywhere on every wall. And I was walking through one of those rooms, and above a doorway, there was a painting. And, I'm 10 years old, something like that. In the doorway there, I'm just completely arrested by it. And when my mother found me, I was just standing there weeping. In the painting itself was the title of the painting was "Emptiness Has a Claim on Death." I have a print of it hanging in my living room right now. My parents tried to buy the original for me, but it was already donated to the museum and they wouldn't sell it. But the print they were able to get for me and gave it to me that year at Christmas. But the painting shows a warrior, a Native American warrior, who's kind of sitting on a hill, and his middle is transparent, that you can see through him. So it's a kind of a realistic painting. It looks almost photographic. But then from his chest to his waist, he's invisible. You can see through him. And you can see on his face that he's grieving. And again, the title of the piece is "Emptiness Has a Claim on Death." And something about that image, before I knew the title, before I knew the story that lies behind it, before I had language for why it was moving, it arrested me. It captured me, really. And I think that awakened something in me. And then in college, as a freshman, I read Moby Dick, and that loosed me, awoke me from a kind of slumber and gave me a way of talking, and drew me to words, to the kind of the drunken joy of the language that's in that book, but also the philosophical, the grieving, the anger that drives that story, the sense of the tragic, but also the tragic comic, right? The absurdity of so much of what's happening. I think that, and then I read George MacDonald's Lilith. I think in many ways, those are the kinds of events that made me a theologian, right? It's novels and paintings that made me a theologian, and films, not theology books. I love reading dogmatics or historical theology because I love art, not the other way around.
Yeah. Someone, they once asked me, I need to know, what's your stance on sin? And I just said, go read Grapes of Wrath. That's... There you go.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And they're like, what do you mean? And I said, you read that. It illustrates what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And more than illustrates, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I was talking with someone the other day about this. The art at its best doesn't merely illustrate a truth. It involves us in it. It involves us in the truth so that we experience the truth from a particular perspective, of course, but we experience the truth and then know it. We know it in a way that we might not yet have language for. We might not be able to rationalize what we know yet. Yeah. Although I think that comes, faith is seeking understanding. But I think music, architecture, painting, poetry, whatever, any of it that's done well, it involves us in a reality. It doesn't just illustrate it. And so to your point, reading Grapes of Wrath, or, and a good example of this would be if someone asks a question about the image of God, I would say to them, depending on who they are and depending on what the setting is, go and read Cormac McCarthy's Child of God, which is about a serial killer and necrophiliac in Tennessee, loosely based on a true story. Read that story. Read the story of Lester Ballard, and then let's talk about what we're talking about when we talk about the image of God.
I have not read that one.
Oh, it's harrowing. Whoever your listeners are, go forward cautiously. It is a harrowing book.
Yeah.
That's why I said I wouldn't just recommend it to anyone who said, let's talk about the image of God.
Yeah.
But under certain circumstances, if you're ready for it, I think that book it's an exploration of what do we mean when we talk about every human person is made in the image of God. What happens when that human person just loses all their humanity? Can you lose all of your humanity? And if so, what are you then? And how are you related at that point to God and to your neighbor? C.S. Lewis, who's an enormous influence for virtually everyone, he argues that you can lose your humanity to the point that there's nothing there left for God to love. In fact, that's what he thinks hell is, that hell is having lost your humanity so completely that there's no you left. There's a line, I think it's in Problem of Pain, where he says, a damned soul is something like the fumes left after a fire has burned out. It's not the wood anymore. It's not the fire. It's just the remains of what once was a fire. And he seems to think that that's what happens to us if we let sin go on and on and on. George MacDonald insists that that's not true. And this is why, so when MacDonald says love is deepest in all that love has loved into being, he means that you can't essentially waste away entirely, because if you are wasting away, what you come to eventually is the fire of God that holds you in being. And I don't think there's any doubt that MacDonald theologically is much sounder than Lewis on that point. But those are the kinds of theological questions that come up when you're reading a work like Child of God.
Yeah, and we want to know, a lot of modern day folks are like, well, which one is it? Tell me the answer. Tell me what you think. Tell me. And it's like, I just like exploring the questions. Let's talk about it. Let's philosophize about it.
And I do think I want to try to thread a needle there. Like I do think there's a kind of facile way of telling people, it's not about the answers, it's about the questions. But I don't think that's quite right. I think there's a sense in which there are things we need to say. We need to make some affirmations. There are answers.
Yes.
But if we live with those answers well, they remain living questions themselves. They open out on other questions.
Whoa.
So that even if I say something like, if you were to ask me, is God good? Well, yes, the answer is yes, God is good. But that is itself a living question, not because God is not good or might turn out not to be good, but because God's goodness is more than I can catch up to, right? So that when I say God is good, I'm not saying enough yet. I'm not saying enough yet because his goodness is too much for me to say.
Wow.
And so I have to live with that answer humbly and playfully. And I think by and large, rabbinic tradition, and this may not quite be fair, but I think you see that humility and playfulness better sometimes in rabbinic tradition than you do Christian dogmatic tradition.
They're used to midrashing the scriptures and exploring it with their imaginations and stories and what ifs. But I really love that the answer becomes a living question, because the way that so many seek the answer is like me as the bug collector when I was 8, you know? It's like I need to grab it, I need to put it dead in the thing, stick a needle through it, it's in my collection, done deal. Don't need to revisit that one again unless I want to show it off. And you're like, no, we don't want it to be a dead answer. We want it to be a living question. My brain kind of popped open a little bit on that one. That's really great.
Yeah, I do think there is a way of engaging truths that's very untruthful. It's trying, as you're saying, it's trying to capture and catalog truths that we have pinned to the page and we can put on display. You know, I caught this truth this time and now I'm done with it, right? And here's the trophy. That's not a truthful relationship to truth.
Yeah.
And there has to be joy, surprise, delight, playfulness, wonder, grief. I mean, the truth has to take us out into the deep places and to the heights and out into the extremes. It's not something that can be managed. The truth is not, it's not an artifact, and it's not a trophy. It's my relation to Jesus and me coming to know him, who is the truth. And that's always opening out on wonder inside of wonder inside of wonder.
Yeah. And that's what art gives you. It almost like, the living questions are the words, but then art is like the tapestry that those things can go on, or the page itself, or it gives you the grounding to keep moving in that playful spirit that you're talking about.
Yeah. Because I think, again, not everything that gets called art is artful in that way, but art that's true to itself, it does awaken the childlikeness in us in a way that also makes us wise, right? So it requires you to face the gone wrongness of the world and all of its ugliness. Again, art that's worthy of the name doesn't sentimentalize, right? It doesn't gloss over anything. It doesn't gild reality. It lets you see the real for what it is, but it does that in a way that opens your spirit up.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just unrelentingly dark, because it's not simply showing you the gone wrongness of the world. It's showing you the gone wrongness of the world in such a way that your spirit rises to meet it. And if it doesn't do that, then it's not poetry worthy of that name, or it's not, a painting worthy of that name, or a novel, or whatever else, a film.
Yeah. I did some exploration when I was doing my doctorate degree on the origins of the term theologian, thinking, when I think theologian, I'm thinking somebody very scientifically, parsing the scriptures. And when I learned that the word theologian is actually it wasn't Christian, it was a Roman term about the person who took the stories of the gods and then put them to liturgical music and poetry for the people so that they can hear and know it, that was a theologian. And the first time it appears in a Christian context, it's used as a footnote in John, who wrote Revelation, saying John the theologian. And then I was just like, wait a second, this is not what I thought it was. This word theologian is more of a poetic, artistic, not necessarily as the scientist putting dead bugs in their little boxes.
It's definitely not that, right? I mean, theology, the theologian is the one who prays. I mean, that's the famous formula, right? But it's also the theologian is the one who sings. The theologian is the one who plays. Like the theologian is someone whose life has come alive in ways that have kind of vivified ways of talking about God, right? So theology is testimony brought to speech that's recognizable and shareable, recognizable as witness to Jesus and the God he reveals. And that requires, again, the opening of spirit, the opening of our imaginations. And I think it's important here to say imagination is not like a capacity we have to make things up. Imagination is our spiritedness coming alive in the way it apprehends the world, in the way that we experience the world and make sense of the world. Imagination is my entire consciousness becoming attuned, more and more attuned to what's presented to it, the mystery of God, the complexity of human being, the absurdity of evil. As my consciousness starts to come aware of that, like imagination is that capacity, right? Not one of the things that I can do if I want to make up a story, say, or tell a lie, but my sensitivity and the keenness of my perception for what is actually happening in God and neighbor, like that we need to mean. And so now when we talk about imagination, we're talking about something closely related to faith.
Yeah. So you saying we should not confuse imagination for just mere creativity.
Yeah. Making stuff up. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so like creativity is not at all, I would argue, is not at all making things up. And I think if you listen to any great artist, sculptor or novelist or poet, they don't make things up very much. Like they'll almost all of them tell you that things come to them, or they notice things, or they're moved by things, and they try to bear witness to it. They don't just bring something out of nothing. I remember in college, I wasn't afflicted with this so much, but I had friends around me who were, they have something coming up, a paper that's due, say, and they don't know what to write. So they're sitting in front of their word processor. Back then, these gigantic desktop computers with a blank page open, just waiting for something to come to them. Right? They don't even know how to begin to write. And I think a lot of us think that art is like that. You're making stuff up. You're inventing from nothing. But really, it's almost always having the kind of spirit that's prepared to receive what shows up. And suddenly there's a story in your head, or there's a character in your head, or there's a line from a poem, or an image you've seen that you now have to put on film or capture with the camera. Like art, the greatest artists are not inventors in that sense. They're witnesses. They've sensed something, they've felt something, and they're testifying to it.
Yeah, the Greeks would call that the genius.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But notice the genius is understood as another voice.
Yes.
Right. Like it's not something they've made for themselves.
Yep.
It's something that's come to them, almost possessed by it. Right?
Yeah. And I've felt what you have just described when, I'm wrestling with, preparing a sermon for the coming Sunday, and I'm reading the text, and it's like, I know what it means, but I don't know what I should say about that yet. And then some insight, a piece of poetry or a painting or just even a story, comes, and then all of a sudden There's that flash that doesn't have words yet. And I know that I have to sit down right now and capture what's about to come out. And it feels exterior and interior at the same time.
I think that's exactly right. I just wrote that line earlier today. Like, the work of the Spirit is always simultaneously without and within. Mm-hmm. The Spirit is coming upon us because the Spirit is rising up within us. Out of your belly will flow rivers of living water, and the Spirit will be poured out on all flesh. Like the coming from without and within. I think experientially we sense that. And if we pay attention to our experience, then traditional Christian language, dogmatic language, can help us recognize, oh, that's what's happening to me. This is a way of naming what I've just experienced, what I've undergone.
I didn't expect this conversation to go this way for this long, but it's so wonderful. Man.
Yeah, it's a delight. I mean, there's nothing really that I enjoy more than kind of reflecting on the spirit in which we read Scripture and the preach and pray. Mm-hmm. We have far too few conversations like this, Tom. So thank you for making this possible.
Yeah. Now, like, what are the faith roots that you have? Like, what's the soil that your life has grown out of that kind of produces this that we see today?
The label for it is classical Pentecostalism. So it's a holiness Pentecostal tradition. It's what I call now sweaty Pentecostalism. We went to church all the time, for hours every time, 4 times a week at least, and very often more than that, for hours every time. And it's loud and boisterous kind of spirituality. It's noisy, smelly spirituality. So much about it that went wrong. I mean, I don't want to romanticize it. There's much about it that is romantic, I think, but also there was much about it that was diseased and disorienting. But that's what shaped me, for good or bad. And I, of course, had a stretch where I distanced myself from a lot of that. But those are the people I've known. I mean, of course, I move in other circles too. And as I've grown and changed over the years, I've entered into more and more circles that are wider and wider. But that's my native tongue, so to speak. The people who speak in tongues.
Yeah. What do you think is something beautiful that came from that soil? And then maybe what are the things that you had to kind of work out of your spirituality?
I think what was beautiful about it was a sense of that God is living and active, right? That God is a force in our lives and a presence in the room. I think if we could make this distinction, in the heat of the moment, when they were talking to God, the Pentecostals that shaped me were doing something beautiful. It's when they shifted out of talking to God to talking for God or about God that they did not know what they were doing, most of them. And it very quickly became something else. I think there was a movement that was a movement of prayer and renewal, a redirection of the heart and the body toward God and the dynamic presence of God. But because they didn't, by and large, those early Pentecostal mothers and fathers, because they didn't find their way back into the heart of the faith, they had a movement that wasn't traditioned well. It wasn't rooted and grounded in the faith. And therefore, they were filling in the gaps, theological, pastoral gaps, unwisely. Mm-hmm. They didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't know what they were doing. So again, we're singing to God or praying to God, being present to God. The wholeheartedness of that, I think, is beautiful. But the moment you shift away from that to talking to someone who's lost a child tragically, or to standing by, someone who's about to die, in those moments we were completely overmatched. Or talking to a couple whose marriage was coming apart, or talking to a child who's been abused, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Like we just didn't have any wisdom. But that's overstated. There were far too few wise people. That's an odd phrasing, but you get my point.
Yeah, there's that classic Pentecostal saying that says, we don't need no education because we have the Holy Ghost. That came out of this like anti-academic movement. Did you see that within that tradition that you grew out of as well?
You do, although there's an irony there. As almost, one of the things that I've said, one of the quips that I throw out from time to time is like, your capacity to appreciate irony is the measure of your trustworthiness as a pastor and a teacher. Like, are you sensitive to irony, and do you recognize it? If you can't, if irony's lost on you, then you don't have the imagination to do the work that's required. And there are deep ironies in that tradition, because there is, even though much of it is framed, and this has been true right from the very beginning, late 1800s, early 1900s, you can see that kind of anti-establishment backlash against higher education and against academic theology in particular. And a lot of that is rhetoric, because they're actually practicing scholarship while they do it. So many of those same people, even it's a kind of populist rhetorical move, but they're devoted to deep study, and they're reading widely. And many of those early leaders were formed in traditions in which they had been ordained and trained for ministry, and then have been kind of brought into an experience of the fire of God that has kind of set their lives ablaze, including their minds. So much of the early work in the tradition, what Walter Holdenberger calls the heart and not the infancy of the movement, is deeply theological. Like there is, even by people who you would think were distancing themselves from the academic, they are distancing themselves from higher education as they understand it. But they're deeply studious. They devour not only scripture, but books about scripture. They're endlessly fascinated by theological conversation. And there's a ferment to it. And much of that work is imaginative. It's deeply shaped by Black experience. It's the slave spirituals and Black preaching style that shape so much of this that I'm calling the classical Pentecostal tradition. Again, Walter Holdenberger has done a lot of work on that front. There wouldn't be classical Pentecostalism without the Black experience. And that artistic instinct that leads to jazz and blues and the call response of preaching and the groan, like all of that stuff is in the DNA of the classical Pentecostalism I grew up with. The problem is the social and economic and political forces that dominated the working class white people that trained me or raised me, those eventually kind of hemmed in and squelched the spirit, lowercase and capital S, spirit of the energy of that movement. And so there were still hints here and there of it. And as I said, when it turned to prayer, you could still feel that at times. But it was ultimately, I think, overcome by those other forces, the worldly forces, the principalities and powers of politics and economics and social class, all of that.
Yeah, I use the term principalities and powers, and from that Pentecostal tradition, they would have used those terms for something else, and I like how you tied it to something very concrete of the political, economic, social forces instead of the demon under every rock kind of a understanding that maybe would have directed that group. Yeah,
absolutely. There was a literal mindedness to our sense of evil, a literal mindedness to everything we did almost, And that is death. I mean, literal mindedness is death. So we mythologized about Satan and demons. In fact, this may sound like exaggeration, but it's not. I think we had a clearer sense of who Satan was, what his powers were, what his agendas were, than we did God. We were certain about Satan's work in our lives in a way we were not sure about God's. And I think that's telling.
Yeah, I've not heard it put to words like that before, but that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, you may have heard me talk about this, but there's a catechism from that period. It was written in the 50s, Pentecostal catechism. And the first chapter is on God. It has the same basic shape as it's coming through the Wesleyan tradition, which is, of course, itself coming from the Anglican tradition. So it has that shape. So the first chapter is on God, and then it moves to angels, and it's stunning. It's stunning, stunning, stunning when I work students through the catechism, how little we know about God when we're done with the chapters on God, and how much we immediately know about angels, right? Like it's striking the way the catechism is set up. You get the impression that we really can't know much about God, but we can know exactly everything we need to know about Satan. And I think it's deeply troubling. It's deeply telling. But it's also fascinating to me. Like, what is it? What kind of movement comes to that place, and how does it get there? Right? How do you get to that place? And some of it's that backlash against what now people call disenchantment, the disenchantment of modernity. There's been a lot of talk now. Charles Taylor's popularized it, and other people, that we live in a kind of disenchanted age. Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't. Like, I lived in a hyper enchanted world. That was a reaction against perceived disenchantment, right? So we lived in a world in which angels and demons were more real than the human beings around us. Mm-hmm. And so I generally think that's true for most people. I think the rumors of disenchantment are greatly exaggerated. I don't know, outside of what elite academics wrote on paper, I'm not sure disenchantment ever really had much leverage anywhere in American life. I think we've all been much more superstitious than that. But the people I grew up in were deeply superstitious. But again, right at the heart of all of it was this sense of there is a living God who speaks and acts and can be spoken to and acted upon. And that there is something holy. So with all of the ways in which I think it was a disoriented and disorienting movement that lost its way in all kinds of ways, there was something true about it right there at the heart.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talk a lot about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and how much of a guide he has been for you. And it seems interesting from my perspective that someone steeped in the Pentecostal tradition would find so much life in, someone coming from a German Lutheran tradition. Can you kind of tell us, what is it about Bonhoeffer that grabbed your attention and imagination and then helped guide you along your pathway?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that I know entirely. The first thing I read by him, which is not going to surprise anyone, was Cost of Discipleship, and I didn't like it. I didn't like it. I was an undergrad at the time. It wasn't taught to me well. Mm-hmm. When it was presented to us, we didn't have enough guidance. Like the professor I don't think gave it the right kind of context, didn't help us read it. Of course, I found out later that Bonhoeffer himself said that it was a very dangerous book and shouldn't be read in separation, or it shouldn't be separated from his other work. And that if it were, it'd be misunderstood. And I think that's what happened. I think Bonhoeffer, unfortunately, he's famous. He's so famous that people think they know his work when they don't really. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's volumes and volumes, 14 plus volumes in the Dietrich Bonhoeffer work series, massive volumes. And he has a lot more to say than warning us against cheap grace. And it's really important, I think, to read more widely. It was reading life together that I think kind of turned my head a bit. Oh, he's saying other things. But I think what struck me about it is there's a truthfulness to him. And it was when I read Ethics that I realized, okay, here's someone who's going to be a companion with me for the rest of my life, you know. So I loved Life Together, but if I had stopped there and hadn't read Ethics, you know, I wouldn't think of myself as deeply in his debt, you know, like he would have remained mostly someone that I had once read and moved past. But not that it's not a finished work, and there are all kinds of ways in which there are problems in the work, things that I think if he had lived, you know, he was 38, I think, when he died.
I think so.
You know, he was still a very young man, and just, I think, starting to grow into a wisdom that would have made him reframe some of what he said, I think, in Ethics. But the devotion to Jesus, the commitment to the way of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus, and the ways in which he was daring enough to recognize the theological implications and the ethical implications of what it means to say that Jesus is Lord. Like I had never encountered that before, and so it's at that point that he became, you know, a father to me, a mentor, a teacher that I would have the rest of my life.
Yeah, I read Life Together, and that was a beautiful book to know the context in which it was written as this, you know, secret seminary, you know, countercultural to,
Yes.
you know, that Nazi movement that was rising up. And when you read that book, it's like, I think this is what the community was supposed to look like.
Yeah.
And, you know, we have more of an entertainment machine in, you know, Western evangelicalism, where, you know, it's like the sin to be bored in church. And
yes,
I don't know, there's something, that's what people are really hungry for, I think, is, you know, that a place to belong. And we say, well, we'll do that in small groups, you know, well, we're going to entertain you on Sundays, and then you do the deep stuff on small groups. And
yeah.
I think we don't know how to do community in this Western culture that we inhabit very well. And I think that book really illustrates it.
Let me tell you how they kind of connect this part of the conversation to the earlier part. And I didn't know that I hadn't thought about this in a long time, but this morning it came back to me that a few years ago, I stumbled onto reading The Strange Glory, which is a great book about Bonhoeffer, a biography about Bonhoeffer by Charles Marsh. And in it, he talks about Bonhoeffer visiting Laredo, Texas. And I shook my head and looked again, like, wait a minute, what? And so I start doing deep dive, trying to find all that I can find about Bonhoeffer's trip. You know, he's in at Union Seminary, goes from there to Philly, from Philly to New Orleans, from New Orleans to San Antonio, spends some time in Laredo, eventually takes a train from San Antonio to Mexico City, sees the Aztec ruins, has a conversation with some local native boy that we don't know exactly all that played out there, but he writes about it in a postcard, a conversation he had with this boy, and then comes back through the American South. That's where he experiences Black spirituality, including Black Pentecostal churches, and then back up to New York. And that notion of Bonhoeffer in Laredo just mesmerized me, right? And so I ended up writing this poem using, at the end of his life, Bonhoeffer wrote a series of poems, and there's a famous one in which he talks about stages on the way to freedom: discipline, action, suffering, and death. And so I used that structure and talked about him moving through those stages in this experience of Laredo. And to your point about the way of life he's calling for, what I imagine kind of in the middle, the action stage, is him in Laredo, standing out. And there was a church in Laredo at the time called St. Paul's. And so I'm imagining him standing there outside that church, kind of coming to terms with what America is, what the world has become. And so let me just read this line and you'll see how it connects to what you just said. And I'm talking about him recognizing the binding truth of this place, knowing that it's named St. Augustine de Laredo. It's settled by a dawn, named for a saint, a station of the West come of age. Remember that line in his letters and papers from prison about the world come of age. No bloodier plot on earth. Right? So he's standing in this city that's named for a saint, but settled by a dawn, and just blood-soaked. And that recognition of this is what happens in the West come of age. We do violence and then attribute it or offer it as homage to a saint.
Wow.
And it's, of course, so the next lines, of course it happened here in this unlovely state, this city of these plains, Christ's words reaching you at last, delayed wounds, flowering late, only just in time. Blessed are the slow of heart. And that line, blessed are the slow of heart, I had stumbled on teaching Life Together, in which I realized like this is what Bonhoeffer believes. Blessed are those who slow down and meet Christ in that, at that rhythm. And I had said in a lecture once, just kind of offhandedly, for him, blessed are the slow of heart. And so that is coming back here again in the poem. But that you can see there that's a bit about me, like how I work.
Yeah.
And it's also, I think, about Bonhoeffer and what his work calls us to, right? The truthfulness of it, that he sees what's happening as it's happening long before others can admit it to themselves. And part of the power of his witness is that he was that truthful. Mm-hmm. And which is why they killed him, right? I mean, that prophets become martyrs because of their truthfulness.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I was going to say that, like, that's what we do to the prophets, and it's been happening. Even Christ was pointing that out, like, you who stone and kill the prophets.
And of course it has to be in Jerusalem, he says, right?
Yeah.
Like the nearer you get to the center, the more at risk you are if you're a prophet.
Mm. Which is why he didn't go to Jerusalem until the end.
That's why he waited, right? So he knew what was going to happen there.
Yeah.
Absolutely right.
I like that slowing down and encountering Christ in the slowness. And you wrote this article, How God Becomes Human, that really captured my attention. And you said we're so often like Anna, bearing witness to Christ coming in the world around us in the lives of our friends and enemies. And we are often like Elizabeth, Mary's cousin, providing sanctuary for those who are giving birth to Christ, as we ourselves are giving birth to that which prepares the way for Christ to come through them. And I don't think we like that. In Western, we want to be the one through whom all the action happens. We want to be the ones through, that make things happen and get the glory. And sometimes we need to slow down to see, what is God doing? Oh, there's leadership rising up in this person over here, and I need to help, raise them up and lift their voice. And I think that's just a really beautiful line. You want to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you see it embodied in Elizabeth. You see it embodied in Mary in a different way. You see it embodied in Joseph. That Joseph. One of the things that stuns me about Mary's husband, Joseph, is that he is sensitive. I mean, he dreams. Notice he dreams God's will for his family. He is protecting the child and the child's mother. But when he dies in the Gospels, it's not reported on. Like, there's no record in the Gospels of what happens when Joseph dies. And I think that's it's one of those things that's not said that speaks loudly, and that he could die without creating drama. And that Jesus and Mary could let him die without there being a ruckus, without there being a tumult around him dying. And I think he leaves the story with a kind of, he essentially disappears off stage and you don't even notice that he's gone. And there's a differentiality to the way that he lives that to me is so much like God, so much like what we see about God, whose work is almost always hidden from us. And hidden because he doesn't need to be the center of attention, right? Another poem that I'd written, the last thing God needs is to be noticed. Like God doesn't need anything. And the last thing he needs is for us to notice that he's doing something. And you see that with Joseph, you see it with Elizabeth, you see it with Mary, you see it with Andrew. Like Andrew is in the Gospel of John, he's the first disciple called, the first apostle. But the first thing he does is defer by bringing Peter to Jesus. And when he brings his brother, he goes and finds his brother and then brings Peter to Jesus. And when he brings him to Jesus, he says, we have found the Lord. We found the Messiah. And he doesn't say, I have, even though he's the first called. And he doesn't say, the Messiah called me. Right? He says, we have found the Lord. And that marks his witness throughout the Gospels and throughout the rest of his life. This, you can see it in Christian iconography, in which Andrew is often shown stepping back with his hands open as Peter takes center place. So he kind of withdraws so that there's room for Peter before Jesus. And that seems to me to capture something essential about the nature of God and the nature of godliness, that we're happy to be. The way that I said it in a sermon a few weeks ago, like Andrew is the overshadowed one. Like he's the one who's known for being Peter's brother. But that's what we know about Andrew. Yeah. That's Simon Peter's brother. He's overshadowed, but he's not afraid of being overshadowed because he knows, like Mary, to be overshadowed is to have the life of Christ shaped in you.
Oh, like the Spirit comes and
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like, can we be comfortable at home in the second place? Like, I mean, this is an explicit part of Jesus' teaching, right? When you go to a meal, do not sit at the head of the table. Take the lowest seat. You know, the first will be last, the last will be first. The on and on, that it's Jesus again and again is making clear, like pushing to the head of the line that's just not what he's calling us to, because that's not who God is. Like that's not what the abundant life looks like.
Yeah.
And there's a way in which it's more blessed to give than to receive. And we have to, there's a line in Philippians that is often, in fact, some translations translate it as if it's not what Paul said. But what Paul actually says is we must consider others better than ourselves. And there's a wrong way to hear that, a kind of slavishness in which I'm punishing myself in order to exalt you, or diminishing myself in order to exalt you. And that is certainly not needed. I don't need to humiliate myself in order for you to be glorified. God doesn't need me to be humiliated in order for God to be glorified. So it's not less or more in that sense. It's not a competitive relation. But I genuinely do have to take more delight in the good that happens to you than in good happening to me. If I can't, if that's not what comes up in me, then I'm not yet really filled with the Spirit of Jesus, because that is what comes up in him.
Wow. I mean, my brain has exploded multiple times in this conversation, and I really could talk to you all day long about this stuff, but I'd like to read something that you wrote as a benediction for this time that we've had. And then I'll give you a last sentence to say if you'd like. But you wrote in that article, sometimes we are not the ones giving birth, but the ones being born. Before we bear Christ for others, others bear us into Christ's likeness. We should never forget that we are held in God long before faith in God becomes our own. We believe only because others believed for us, and we go on believing only as others continue to believe for us and in us. We are carried in the womb of others' faith in such a way that we come to bear others in our faith. Christ is formed in us, and so we become mothers of God. Through our labors, our prayers, and our tears, our acts of mercy, and our cries for justice, we share in the sufferings of Christ, groaning to give birth to all that God purposes for creation.
Amen. I mean, Lord, I believe it. I hope that it's in some way becoming true for me. I know it's true in the sense that people have borne me. I mean, I hope I'm able to bear others in something like the way I've been born.
I'll bear witness that it's happening. And I just want to thank you for your voice. I want to thank you for your art, your writing, and what you're doing in this world. It is truly birthing Christ in some very needed places. So thank you.
Thank you. It's a joy. I love the spirit of this conversation.
And that brings us to the end of our recast episode with Dr. Chris Green. I hope you enjoyed this exploration of art, imagination, and theology as much as I did. His insights continue to resonate deeply with me, and I believe his perspective on living questions versus those trophy answers is something that we can all reflect on in our own spiritual journeys. So if you found this episode meaningful or helpful, please consider sharing it with your friends and your community. Don't forget to check out Dr. Green's book, All Things Beautiful and Aesthetic Christology. And as always, thank you so much for tuning in to the Liminal Living Podcast. Stay tuned for some more recast episodes this August, each with their own new introduction and outro to enrich your listening experience. That was French. Until next time, I am Tom Rundell, the curator of conversations of this podcast, encouraging you to embrace the liminality spaces of your life and explore the questions that you have. Peace out.
It's time to get the world talking about Black-led brands. We all have our favorites, our ride or dies, and the ones we can count on to help us live out our best lives. But we can't keep them all to ourselves, so if you're feeling like Black Opal Beauty, tell somebody. If the lip bar gives you a lip for every drip, let them know. And if your hair is doing the do, shout that out too. Because one shout out leads to another, and almost half of Black-led brands are discovered by word of mouth. Join Walmart in shouting out your favorite Black-led products, creating a new world of choices at walmart.com/Black and Unlimited.